Well, thank you very much. This is Worldviews, and we have with us a very eminent professor of economics, Professor Richard Wolff, who's very well known for his analysis of the economy, global economy, and his economic update on YouTube is followed, I believe, by countless amount of people, and including myself, and it allows me to understand capitalism a little better. Um, um, and we'll get into that. And of course, Professor Wolff's most recent book is entitled Understanding Capitalism. And we will get into the capitalist world and post-capitalism, if we may. But before we do, let's get to the chase and look at today's world in terms of economic activity and the geopolitical shifts that are underway in the world. So, my first question is, if we could divide the globe into three zones: the North American zone, Europe, and Asia, and the interplay between the three. Let's start with the United States, which some say, including you, Professor Wolff, is a declining empire economically, perhaps financially, which I'm not very familiar with, but you could explain to us the mechanics of the financial decline. How do you see, Professor, America's position as it is a waning superpower in the world of economic activity? Is this very noticeable? Could you give us some specific examples? And is America's economic or financial decline or diminishing clout a irreversible phenomenon?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me try to give you a summary view. I don't think there is much doubt, certainly not in my mind, but in an increasing number of people's mind, there's not much doubt that the economic power, footprint, influence, whatever you want to call it, of the United States is now declining. Had you been reasonable, you would have known that the extraordinary situation of the United States at the end of World War II, 1945, was a situation that could not, in any case, have been sustained for very long. Let me remind everyone, with the end of World War II, all of the other countries that might have been competitors for the United States, economically, politically, and militarily, were destroyed and unable to do that. Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, that's it. They were the ones who might have, and they were all destroyed or destroyed each other in the war. With the exception of the early days in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, no bombs fell on the United States, no war was fought here, no destruction took place, and the number of Americans who died in the military was much smaller than the deaths, both military and civilian, across Europe and beyond in other parts of the world. So the United States emerged as absolutely dominant. The empire that had tried to survive, the British Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries, was also destroyed. That is why in the immediate aftermath, in the 10 years after 1945, most of the empires of France, Britain, Holland, and so on were destroyed. There were revolutions of one kind or another, Gandhi in India, the Mau Mau in Kenya, and I could go on. Everybody knows it took a little longer for Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam against the French, but the direction was unmistakable. The 18th and 19th centuries of colonialism were over. These parts of the world had become independent, and the United States inherited, you might say, the British Empire. It pushed the British out when it needed to and replaced them. And the United States was dominant, and the signs of it were everywhere. Where did the post-war financial agreements about the world trade happen? In New Hampshire, here in the United States, in a place called Bretton Woods. The British pound stopped being the international currency of the world and was replaced by the US dollar, which has held that position until the last 10 years, and it is now in the process of losing it, which is a sign of the decline. I'll give you a couple of examples. As little as 20 years ago, central banks around the world, every one of whom keeps a reserve to support its currency. So if you have Malaysian currency or Nigerian currency or Peruvian currency, you can go to your bank and cash it in for either gold or dollars to show that people should have confidence in using local currencies. Well, the reserves held by most central banks, 80% of them were in US dollars. The dollar was as good as gold. Today, it's about 45%. The dollar is not as good as gold, and the dollar keeps shrinking. Number two, a century ago, the United States was not the largest debtor country in the world. It was, in fact, closer to being a creditor country because it had lent so much money to the Europeans to fight World War I. Today, the United States is the largest debtor country in the world. It owes more money to foreigners than any other country. And the two largest holders of the debt of the United States are Japan and the People's Republic of China. The second one there is very important because it wasn't long ago that the number one creditor of the United States, it was a matter of 2 or 3 years ago, was the People's Republic of China. But they have lost confidence in the United States, and they've sold off $300 or $400 billion of dollar assets because they don't have confidence in the dollar, nor do many, many others. Perhaps the most important statistic I could give you is to say that in the economics profession, I've been a professor of economics all my life. In the economics profession, we have a rough measure of the size and strength of an economy. It's called GDP, gross domestic product. If you add up the GDP of the United States and its major allies, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, the G7, that if you add up the GDPs of all of them, it's about 28, 29% of global GDP in just those 7 countries, even though there are 190 countries in the world. That's a sign of how big the United States still is. But if you look at the People's Republic of China and its major allies, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that's now about 33% of global GDP. In other words, China and its major allies are now a bigger, richer bloc in the world economy than the United States and its major allies, including Europe, Western Europe. This is an earth-changing, historic transformation. It means that every country Every country of the 190 in the world today is rethinking its global relationships, where it buys its crucial inputs, where it sells its crucial products, where it borrows, where it encourages investment. It used to always be you must go to London or Washington or Paris or something like that. Now you have an option. You can go to Beijing or New Delhi, and every strategy is changing, and they're changing to diminish the importance and the role of the United States and the G7, and to enlarge and raise the importance of the others. And especially in that part of the world known these days as the global South, that other big block of the world economy, other than North America, Europe, and Asia, although there's overlap, obviously, a little bit between global South and Asia particularly, but that global South is now in the middle of repositioning itself more and more. There are a dozen countries applying to join the BRICS. They are not applying to join the G7, et cetera, et cetera. So the only interesting thing to say beyond, and I could go on, but the only interesting thing to say is to understand that this decline was not prepared for. The United States and Western Europe did not prepare for what is happening. They had the whole of the 19th and 20th centuries to prepare for the decline of Europe and the rise of the United States. And they tried to stop it. The British tried to stop it with the War of Independence in 1776. They tried again to stop it in the War of 1812. Both of those wars Britain lost and the United States won. After that, they didn't try again. So it is important to understand that they accommodated themselves in Europe to the decline of Europe relative to the rise of the United States. But nothing comparable has ever happened to the United States. It is engaged to this moment as I speak to you in a massive program of what psychologists call denial.
Exactly.
Which is not a river in Egypt. It is a problem of the West, particularly the United States, but Western Europe participates, and they don't know what to do. The leaders are afraid to recognize this situation because it will be used domestically by their political enemies. Republicans will denounce Democrats if they say so, and vice versa if they say so. So we have a competition of our political leaders in what you should call pretend. The war in Ukraine is a pretense that we, the West, are in a position to make the decisions about what happens. We can tell the Russians we won't expand NATO. We expand NATO anyway. We keep expanding NATO. Putin tells us you can't take Ukraine too. We will, we can, we shall, the way we always did. And then the Russians say, no, we will now fight a war. And we are told by our president, we will destroy Putin. We will declare he's just another Stalin, and we will bring Russia to its knees and destroy the ruble. President Biden said that, and everybody cheered. All wrong. Nothing happened. Russia didn't collapse, the ruble didn't fall down, and Russia is winning that war. Easy, obvious for anyone not blinded. But the American people, and I am an American, I live and work here, have all my life, are not able to see this. So the process continues, and it continues to get worse and worse. And the big issue, and I am not an alarmist. I'm not, but I have to say to you, the big issue is whether the level of denial will continue and get us closer and closer to a nuclear war of some sort, whether it explodes in Ukraine, or it explodes in Gaza, or it explodes in the South China Sea around Taiwan. These are all areas where the United States and Western Europe are acting as if they can do now what they could do in the decades after World War II. You can't. It's not the world it was. And that accommodation, that adjustment, that's the big billion-dollar question right now.
I'm glad you mentioned geopolitics. I guess I'm the geopolitician in the space. You're the economist, but I guess we have overlapping interests. And if we could stick just a little bit before we get into the geopolitics of economics, which they do overlap, it's fascinating what you said. Those signs are very clear to the average Joe Sixpack, if I may say, that the United States has become from a creditor nation to a debtor nation. That's very clear, as you pointed out, Professor. Then the in terms of gold reserves, it's diminishing. The United States, dominance in that domain. Um, but when we mention the BRICS, of course, it's a countervailing force to the United States and the G7 nations. And before we shift to Europe, of course, the G7 comprises many European countries. If we expand the G7 to the G20, could we see any kind of a rivalry between the emerging BRICS bloc of nations and a G20 kind of anti-BRIC bloc, if you will? Is there a possibility that in the economic realm these two may clash?
I think there's a possibility. I mean, I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can. There is a possibility, but I see many more signs of disunity, disagreement inside Europe, I'm speaking now, than I do of any great coming together. I think, without being conspiratorial, that the United States has always had a very ambivalent attitude towards European unity. If that unity can be brought in behind the United States, well, then it's all well and good. But when it can't, they don't want a unity that could do anything else, whether it became an independent, neutral third bloc, which many Europeans would support, or it became allied with the BRICS, which other Europeans support. I want to remind people who may not know that Hungary is already an ally of the BRICS. Greece is in many ways already an ally of the BRICS. Other countries are thinking of it. Emmanuel Macron even asked whether France could become part of the BRICS. They turned him down, but those are signs. And even if, let's take the most ambitious scenario, you do have to remember, in the longer run, whether it's G7, G15, G20, or any number, the mass of the people of this planet are not Europeans. And in the end, now that they have an enormously powerful economic base, that's what will be the determinant. A Europe unified, even with the United States, is not a match for India and China and Russia if you combine the population dominance, the resource base, and the economic industrial achievement they've made. I would not bet, if I were a betting person, you have to come to terms with this. It doesn't matter anymore. It's too late. Maybe your idea, had it been tried 30, 40 years ago, maybe, but not now. Not, at this point, no, I don't see any way that you're going to get out of a situation in which the West, as we know it, Western Europe, Japan, and the United States are not in a declining situation. And my own guess, it's just a guess, my own guess is as this becomes more clear, more pronounced, as the consequences of this show themselves more and more, you're going to see one after another of those on the West looking to find a home with those on the East. When
That's
Mr.
precisely,
when
yeah,
Mr.
that, sorry.
Putin, early in the war, early after the war in Ukraine starts in February of 2022, Putin makes a remarkable speech in which he says, okay, that's it for Europe. We are turning to the East. And I watch where the gas lines and the oil lines are being built. I understand where the markets are being created. It's not with the West, it's with the East. And that's a mutually beneficial program for Russia and for India, for Russia and for China. And that China could play the role, for example, of bringing together Iran and Saudi Arabia, that's a sign, a spectacular change in how the world works that I think is just part of it. Let me give you an economics example that may drive it home. Over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a race around the world to develop electric vehicles, electric automobiles, and electric trucks to carry freight. Okay, that contest is now essentially over. The West tried to do it, Europe, United States, and China tried to do it. They all did it with this difference. The Chinese vehicles are cheaper and better, much better, much cheaper. Okay, in a normal economic capitalist system, the world would now turn to China for the next generation of vehicles, the way the world turned to the United States in the previous generation for vehicles. In that case, petroleum driven vehicles. But the West won't allow this. The West has shut down international trade in electric vehicles. The United States, President Biden, a few months ago, raised the existing tariff against Chinese electric vehicles from 27.5% to 100%. That means a $30,000 car, electric car from China, arrives in New York. An American can buy it, but will have to pay $1,000 going to China to pay for it, plus, 30,000 to China to pay for it, plus another 30,000, 100% in tariff tax to Uncle Sam, so that the car will cost an American 60,000, not 30. Therefore, there are no Chinese electric vehicles on the road in the United States today. Europe only has a 10 to 20% tax, now being raised, we're in the middle of that, to about 35%. And a quarter of the electric cars in Europe are now Chinese, because the Chinese can absorb 30% and still sell cars. Canada yesterday decided to follow the United States and raise tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles 100%, proving to everyone that the United States still has power. It's just over its Canadian neighbor and not much else. It's a pathetic comment on Mr. Trudeau, but what do you expect? He's been that way all the way through. All right, here's what's going to happen. All over the world, every company that has to buy electric cars or electric trucks, everywhere in the world, will buy the Chinese because it's the best and it's the cheapest. Americans will be unable to do that. Europeans will have to pay much more. Okay, now let's follow the logic. That means the price of an American company selling something for which electric vehicles are an input will have to be higher because they have to pay much more for the electric truck than people who buy the Chinese. That means every American company is at a disadvantage with the rest of the world because the rest of the world can access a cheap input. It has the same effect as discovering oil somewhere that everybody else in the world can access at, $10 a barrel, whereas we here in the United States have to pay $80 a barrel. It's an unsustainable arrangement. That's part of
So the United
why.
States is at a disadvantage, absolutely. But if we stick with Europe, and I'm glad you pointed out that the Europeans are allowed, if I may say, to buy Chinese-made electric vehicles, so that kind of is perhaps makes it easier for the European consumer to get something of good quality that's cheaper. And if we stick with Europe, don't we see that Europe is in a kind of there is a vassalization compared towards the United States. They must follow the line, but yet Europe is flirting with China. As you pointed out, China is the economic superpower also in the world, and the Europeans want to perhaps shift away from American dominance and cooperate with China in manufacturing, like you say, electric vehicles, but and planes, but at the same time, China is a great competitor for the Europeans. How do you see Europe positioning itself between these two behemoths, the United States empire and the rising China Eastern Empire? Will Europe have the choice to deal economically with both, or will they have to stay as American vassals, or will they be able to shift away towards the rising Chinese empire?
Well, I think over time, they're going to be shifting more and more towards the Chinese because of all these things that I've just been saying. It's a better bet. They will try, and I agree with you. They will try to continue to play both sides against the other one. That's what's true all over the global South. You pick a country in Asia, Africa, Latin America, they will go to Beijing and try to get a loan, but they'll go to Washington and try to get a loan, and then they'll get a loan. The Chinese, by the way, for the last 10 years have been giving loans on better terms, and so they've been going to the Chinese. The Europeans would be in much better position if they were unified, but they're not unified, and I don't see the ability for them to be unified. Look, in Europe, the economic powerhouse was Germany. And in Germany, they love to talk about the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle.
Economic miracle.
Right. My first language is German, so I grew up speaking German.
Alles klar.
Yeah, yeah. Meine Mutter ist in Berlin geboren. Anyway,
freut mich.
The fuel, the energy for being a Wirtschaftswunder was cheap Russian oil and gas. The amazing reality for Europe is that the war in Ukraine, which most Europeans do not want, was pursued and forced mostly by the United States and Britain, and it has damaged European economics on a scale that makes one take a step back and say, what kind of leadership would permit this? What kind of leadership would allow Germany to become the drag on Europe rather than the engine of its economic development? And I know enough about German society and German politics. I also follow French society and French politics, partly because my father was born in France and I speak French for that reason too. Um, they those two societies include an enormous part of their population at the bottom and at the top who are against these policies, who don't want them to continue, who are, I know of German industrialists going to that government and saying, if you don't get us cheap energy, we will move our production out of Germany to these 6 places that are offering us everything. If we make Volkswagens over there, or if we make electric machinery for Siemens over there, etc., etc. I know that, and I know it's a very tense situation. I also know that all bets are off because of the results of that French election. Now, Americans do not follow this material, so they don't know. But it is a remarkable thing that the 4 left-wing parties in France were able to get together. It's remarkable that they stay together. It's remarkable that they are now the largest political bloc in the Assemblée Nationale in France. It's remarkable that their leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, yesterday moved to impeach Macron because he's not giving them the chance to form a government. It forces Macron into the most grotesque anti-democratic, I will not do what every democracy has done before in France. I will not, because I know that you can't form a government. What? That's not your job. And even if he survives impeachment, he is badly weakened. He came in 3rd in the first round of the French election. The people in France, my family included, hate him. They hate him. They hate him as a rich kid who doesn't know what he's doing and is compromised. Very. So I see in Europe levels of disagreement and hostility and distrust at the same time that the United States wants them to be the vassal, and the Chinese are saying, here's a lot of candy. Here's a lot of very nice things that we can work out with you.
So before we move on to the last sort of segment of this very interesting interview where we cover the globe practically, from Europe to China, um, um, what about the Europeans? They seem to be adrift. There is not one major power that's keeping Europe united. Germany is sputtering in terms of its economic uh, Wirtschaftswunder that's going
Yeah.
bust in a way because the Russians have been politely told not to sell their oil to the Germans, and then we saw a firecracker go off, and that was it, and no more oil for the Germans. And France is in disarray domestically, politically. I want to ask you if it's a big question, but I guess it's important to ask: is there a future for the European Union, or are we going to go back to the nation state eventually, and nationalism will come to the fore in Europe?
Everybody wants to know. I don't I don't feel as though I have a clear sense of which way this will go. It is at this point the unification looks very odd, very difficult. The political differences are becoming explosive. Uh, Let me take an example, even though it's not the mainland. Britain. I mean, Britain just saw an extraordinary election. The British people turned their back on 15 years of Conservative Party government. 10 million people who voted for the Conservatives didn't vote. They didn't vote for Labour, by the way. They don't like the Labor Party. The Labor Party's got a lot of problems, but they are so hostile. What you have in more and more of these countries, and this includes the United States, you don't have voting for the people you want. You have voting against the people who are worse. This is, but after a certain point, this risks becoming a social explosion because the political leaders don't have the courage to be new and different, and the population wants new and different, and this is not a resolvable issue, and it will blow up. We had a taste of that in this country with Donald Trump. He is the product of that situation. The mass of people didn't want the conservative Republicans, and they don't want the similarly conservative Democrats like Biden. And so they went for Trump. And when they got Biden, they became more convinced they're going to go for Trump again, even though more and more of them see that there's nothing really there. The Democrats did the smart thing. They got rid of Biden and they brought in someone who's young and has energy, and maybe that will be, and here we go, one last effort to mobilize hope, to mobilize energy. But it's hard. People are, if she loses, or if she wins and doesn't do much, it will be very difficult the next 4 years, because you have done nothing to deal with the underlying problem, because they don't admit there is an underlying problem. They don't admit that American empire is disappearing. They don't admit that American capitalism is shrinking. They don't admit that for the first time in a century, the United States has an economic competitor. I try to remind people, because it's important for Europe too. Over the last century, I'll pick 10, 15 years ago, the GDP of the United States, $20 trillion. The GDP of Russia, $1.5 trillion. There never was an economic competition, because you had an enormous giant here and you had a mouse over here. Maybe they had nuclear weapons. I understand that. That's serious. But economic competitor, no, never close. Now with China, they have and they don't know they don't understand. They think it's just electric cars or solar panels or microprocessing chips. Those are just the first industries. They came down and punished the Huawei Corporation. It's now more successful than its American competitors. The Chinese rescued it and moved it up. Yeah. How many times does this have to happen? My guess is that the Europeans, they are going to face their moment of justice, and they're going to be, here's a prediction I will make. The current leaders in Europe, center-right, the Macrons, the Richie Sunaks, the Stolz in Germany, the center-right, all of the leaders of the European Union, and they are going to be thrown out the way,
swept away.
Yeah, the way the conservatives were in England, because it's going to be easy. But it's not at all clear what you get in replacement. Just like it's very unclear here if Kamala Harris wins. And she does have now this new, hopeful, maybe, and that's very powerful. And against it, Mr. Trump does not know what to do. But we don't know where that's going to take us. That's an open question.
And we couldn't possibly resist getting into American domestic politics ahead of the election. I'm glad we touched on it, but it's a bit toxic at the moment, and but it's very fascinating to discuss indeed. And as a journalist and geopolitician, I do appreciate these insights. And before we shift to China in our last portion of this interview, Yeah, I'd like to talk about one of your favorite subjects, and I follow you, of course, on YouTube, which is the big stick that the United States uses, a little bit too much of a punishing blow called sanctions. If you could explain to us why are overusing sanctions a bad idea? And of course, it doesn't make the United States very popular in the rest of the world. Um, do you see the sanctions mania continuing? Or if Kamala or Trump come to power, will they show a bit of a carrot to some of their competitors or economic rivals or even geopolitical enemies and perhaps soften the blow of sanctions? Or are we going to be sticking with this sanction mania that the United States is so obsessed with?
Let me respond quickly just to go over the sanctions. The sanction is an explicit act against a foreign enterprise, a foreign political movement, a foreign politician, or a foreign country. So it has the quality which American politicians like. It hurts somebody else. It does not hurt, at least not in an immediate, obvious way, a constituency at home in most cases. What the people believe who do this is that the desire not to be hurt will lead the object of the sanctions to alter their behavior in one way or another. Does it sometimes do that? Yes. Yeah, sometimes it works. Does it sometimes fail? Yes. But the failures, in my judgment, are larger, more numerous, and more lasting than the success. And even the successes leave an enormous sense of bitterness and anger and hostility that have to be counted as the costs of whatever success they have. Now, to keep in mind, whenever sanctions are levied by the United States or by others, I recently saw a tabulation of sanctions these days. The United States ranks number 1 in the world for the number of sanctions that it imposes. 15,000 at this point. The number 2 country that imposes sanctions, believe it or not, is Switzerland with 5,000. And then there's the rest of the world, which doesn't do much of it at all. The first thing that happens to anybody who's sanctioned is that they pass on whatever pain the sanction imposes onto others. That's how the system works. So, for example, if you impose a sanction on a company that increases its costs, it will raise its prices. And it will tell everybody who's unhappy about the fact that they raised their prices that they agree with them. It's because of the U.S. sanctions. So the anger at the rising inflation is directed to the United States. They can be and they are blamed. Let me give you the starkest example. The United States has imposed sanctions on Cuba since the 1960s, more than half a century. The goal has been from the beginning to change the Cuban government. By that measure, the sanctions have failed. Did they hold back the Cuban economy? Yes. Did they cause a lot of damage and pain? Yes. And what is it that the Cuban government did? Blame the United States for all of that, which was very plausible and very persuasive, and is one of the reasons that the United States can't control Cuba today any more than it could 20, 40, or 60 years ago. It's an unbelievably failed strategy. Number two, it is easy to get around sanctions. If you can't buy oil or gas from Russia, you can buy it from, I don't know, I'll pick a country, Tanzania. How do you do that? You have the Russians send the oil to Tanzania, you take it off one ship, put it on another, and ship it from Tanzania to Bremerhaven, and then you have the oil. It's Russian oil. You can't tell that, or if you can, nobody bothers. Does it raise the price of the oil? Yes. And who is told the reason for it? Everybody. Why is that? Because of the, in the end, the negative publicity for the United States, the ability when the Chinese get up and say, the Americans are singling us out, trying to hold us back, the people wonder why the United Nations votes with China, because they all see it all the time. They see the sanctions as the policy of the United States. And when the Chinese say, you know, we are the victims, they all feel, yes, you are the victim. And so do their people, and so do their newspapers, and so do their editorial writers. There will be a
And so does
politician.
the yeah, and so does the global South. They see this, they have empathy and sympathy for China precisely because of these
Absolutely.
sanctions.
But I think
And
eventually you will see an American politician, perhaps sooner than we might expect, who gets up and says that, who can articulate anti-China and anti-Russian or whatever, but say these policies are not only not helping the situation, they're making it worse. And on that basis, might win people who are very frustrated. Look, when I say, and I give public speeches, I used to more before the pandemic than I do now, but I still do some now. When I explain to people that the United States, Americans, that the United States lost the war in Vietnam, and it lost the war in Afghanistan, and it lost the war in Iraq, and it's losing the war in Ukraine, I can see in the faces of my American audience, they don't want to believe that. They don't, half of them don't believe me now. They think somehow, even though I'm an authority figure, I'm a professor and all of that, and I know how to speak, that somehow that can't be because they
they're
live,
completely dumbfounded. They're
yes,
dumbfounded.
they are shocked by all of that, you know, and the attempt to say
And
that,
this realization is you professor are bringing this to the fore here in this forum, but this realization is, I think, beginning to sink in.
yes,
And it
slowly.
and speaking of China, which I believe is keeping a very close eye on America's decline, for better or for worse. Speaking about your book, Understanding Capitalism, I don't know if it's fair to say, since you're the economist, if we're living in a post-capitalist world, but it seems the West is disillusioned with capitalism. I am, to a certain extent, coming from the middle class, and I see that middle class simply evaporating in front of my eyes in my lifetime. Do we see the West adopting any of China's mix between capitalism and state dirigism or communism in the future? And are the BRICS going to be the main uh, pole for economic activity and growth in the world in the future?
The way I see it, the what the Chinese achieved is they did not accept the private capitalist model that you might best identify with Britain and the United States. They didn't. But likewise, they did not accept the model of the Soviet Union, the sort of total state owned and operated industrial system. What they produced was a hybrid. They produced an economy that is roughly half one, half the other. And they made that workable by having a powerful political party, the Communist Party, in control of a powerful regulatory state apparatus. They constructed this in the 50 years after their 1949 revolution. And they broke from the West, and people may not remember this. They broke from the Soviet Union after 1960, very violently and very completely, and they constructed this hybrid. What they achieved with that hybrid is the fastest economic growth the world has ever seen. They went from one of the poorest countries on earth toward the end of the 20th century to a superpower basically one generation later. I mean, that's unbelievable. They accomplished something like the Industrial Revolution, which in Europe took 3 or 4 centuries. They did it in 3 or 4 decades. No one can take that. You can't undo that. You can't roll that back. You can't, in the end, pretend it didn't happen. The United States is trying to pretend it didn't happen. But every day it's clearer and clearer that it did. I want to remind people of a piece of history. When the revolution succeeded in China in 1949, the first reaction in the United States was to assume not that Mao Zedong or the Eighth Root Army or the Communist Party was an important cause. The language in this country, for those who never did the history, was a debate between Republicans and Democrats who was responsible for, and now I quote, losing China. In other words, the implication was we had it and then we lost it. And much of the McCarthyite hunt for the communists here was to try to find the bad government officials who were secretly delivering so that we would lose China. When that passed, the next phase was to pretend China didn't exist. It was a poor, backward country. Nobody cared. We did not recognize it. That's the symbolism of it. And the only people who went there were a few left-wingers and a few missionaries. And there weren't enough of them to make a difference. As Europe recovered from World War II, ditto Japan, they began to realize that the Chinese were becoming an interesting market and an interesting source of value. And they began moving, buying, selling, investing. By the end of the 1960s, American competitors of the European and Japanese companies made the American government change its position. We want to do what our Japanese and European competitors are doing. And so Nixon and Kissinger went to China and opened it up. Wonderful language. They recognized it and they set about delivering to Americans the ideology that this would make China like the United States and therefore not dangerous. Complete crazy, but no more crazy than the other way. So, and what that did was give China the opportunity. At the turn of the century, you added membership in the World Trade Organization. Now China could do what it decided was its strategy, to become the manufacturing center of the world, the exporter to everywhere else. And they offered low wages to anybody who would set up a business, and they offered the fast rising, enormous Chinese market. And entrepreneurs from all over the world went to China because everybody has learned low wages, growing market, those are the recipes for capitalist success. Okay, I therefore, with this history, I suspect that what you're going to see is a growing chorus of American corporations saying to American politicians, the attempt to stop China is failing. We have more to lose by continuing this failed policy, which, by the way, includes all the sanctions. We need to reopen. Let's work out with China. Sorry for this. We have to work out with China a
So on
live
a
and
positive
let
note,
live.
you see a positive dialogue or resolution
Yes,
in
yes,
this competitive mode between the West and the rising Chinese
yes.
superpower,
And it will
economic
come,
superpower.
it
And
has to come from the United States. It will come from the United States, and it will come from the leading capitalists who see more space for them to exist and grow by working out a deal than by warfare, conflict, risk of nuclear war, climate catastrophe. They kind of beginning to understand. Look, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, probably the most important capitalist organization among many, has opposed the tariffs, has opposed Trump, has opposed Biden all the way through. They have been consistent. This is not, and it's not just, laissez faire ideology. This is their CEOs. They don't want this. They do not want this. And I think that's where ironically, since these are my ideological enemies, it's from them that I see the only chance at this point. Now, it's possible that a reinvigorated labor movement could from below make a similar demand. It's even possible that an alliance of the big business and the labor movement could do this in a way that nobody could stop. And the country where I see that happening next is France, because the big business in France are watching their little puppet Macron fail totally. And they're going to look at this new Macron, this new unity, and say, okay, we can work something out with them.
well, that sounds positive, and I it's not wishful thinking if you say so, Professor, because if American capitalists want to make coexist with China, that's something we can see positively. And of course, whether France is in a pre-revolutionary mode or not, we know how that ended with Dr. Guillotine. I
Yeah.
certainly, as a European, don't wish for that. Professor, I want to thank you so
But
much
but
for this global overview.
all right,
And
let me just respond. The French Revolution led to many things in addition to the guillotine. There is no Beethoven without that revolution. There is no Marx without that revolution. There is no liberal Europe, no social democracy, none of it. That revolution inspired all of that alongside of the guillotine and alongside of Napoleon and some of the other things that we don't like. The world doesn't deliver to us good things without bad or bad without good. Hegel taught us that, and it's an important lesson.
when I was student in France at the Sciences Po, I always looked at the coin liberté, fraternité, and égalité. So you
Right.
certainly made that point. Those principles have
Yes.
made the world a better place. Thank you so much, Professor Wolff, for your insights on economics and geopolitics. And I would like to remind everybody about your book, Understanding Capitalism, and of course, to tune into your economic update regularly. Thank you so much again, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to chat again.
All
Thank
right,
you for coming
Mike.
on Worldviews.
Glad to do it. And thank you for producing a program and having this kind of a conversation, which is absolutely crucial to whatever happens in the years ahead.
My pleasure. Cheerio.